maybe we are not even talking about the same thing. So thank you, Jenny.
Oh, Marco, thank you.
And,
yeah. Well, Marco, first I have to thank Marco I've been wanting to meet him for years, and I've been wanting to come to Italy for years, and the perfect storm of timing and everything was allowed me to come here. It's a beautiful country. Marco, thanks for having me. So today's talk, you can interrupt me. I've left time for questions at the end, but there will be times where, if something jumps out at you, you want to stop me and ask a question, please feel free. So again, I have a background in cognitive psychology, but also in linguistics and speech therapy. So I came up sort of learning about Alzheimer's disease and semantic deficits in Alzheimer's disease. In the last few years, I've been doing more developing computational tools and open source software analyzing sort of how to analyze language decline and really sort of look at concepts. And so we're going to get right into it with what are concepts. So if we look at sort of the modern literature in cognitive psychology around how we define concepts, we can look to this famous paper by Endel-Tulving in 1972, where Endel-Tulving described this distinction between episodic memory and semantic memory. And Tulving's idea then in 72 was very, very different than how linguists define lexical semantics. So Tulving thought that semantic memory is dedicated to both it's basically the supramodal store that lives above words, it lives above images. It basically then informs word meaning and informs object meaning, all sorts of other things. So basically, semantic memory is this multimodal store, abstract store that word meaning is built upon. When linguists talk about lexical semantic, typically how they're referring to is meaning derived from words, phrases, sentences, right? And so this is one big distinction between when a linguist talks about formal semantics or lexical semantics. They mean a very different thing than Endel-Tulving when he's talking about concepts. So one of the things, and we sort of like, well, how are concepts or how is semantic memory represented in the brain is one fundamental question in cognitive science. People typically end up looking to this meta-analysis, very, very famous on basically where is the semantic system. It's Jeff Binder's paper, 2009, still widely cited. And Binder showed this image from this ALE activation likelihood estimate study, synthesizing many, many studies of semantic memory and showing this distribution in the temporal lobe, anterior temporal lobe, middle temporal gyrus, sweeping up to the angular gyrus, and then here on medial structure, and then on the ventral surface of the brain. One thing that you'll notice here is there's no right hemisphere in this meta-analysis, right? Which begs the question, do we need a right hemisphere for conceptual knowledge, right? This is like the things that we know what apples are and cars are. Why is the right hemisphere not represented in this meta-analysis at all? Do we need a right hemisphere? So there isn't that much literature on what the role of the right hemisphere is in semantic memory. Some of the literature comes out of what's called coarse coding theory. In coarse coding theory, that predicts basically the idea is that the left hemisphere sort of hones in on concepts, right? So it is this and specific features of concepts. But what the right hemisphere does is it activates broader semantic fields. So it does sort of remote association. So if you were to say, if I say the word dog and you say cat, the right hemisphere would sort of open up this wider field of associations associated with dog. Whereas the left hemisphere is very, very focused on, very, very specific semantic associates. The right hemisphere also appears to activate diffuse or non-diagnostic semantic features, but then also alternate explanations of things. So people who are interested in creativity and metaphor comprehension, the right hemisphere is important for irony, sarcasm, metaphor, and non-literal meanings of words, right? And then in general, one theory about the right hemisphere is that it does holistic processing or integration of words to give you the sort of the global meaning of a story or discourse. So, how do we know what is this? What is right hemisphere? When you have damage to the right hemisphere of your brain, what does that look like? So the common things clinically that you'll see is anosagnosia, which is unawareness of your deficits. People with right hemisphere disorders don't know that anything's wrong. Prosopagnosia, when the ventral temporal damage on the right hemisphere, people have face blindness or face perception problems. Hemispatial neglect. So this is the one thing. So right hemisphere damage typically associated with left neglect, sensory neglect, and then this famous paper that I discovered. This is actually the, what are we looking at? What map are we looking at here? Anyone recognize it? Yeah, it's the all right. So it's the piazza here in town, right? And so Luzzati, who was Marco's PhD advisor, did this very, very famous paper, cognitive neuropsychological case study, and I went back and looked at it. It's in Cortex. It was only a note, but it's been cited now, I think, almost 3,000 times. This study of a patient with right hemisphere neglect, so right hemisphere damage. Claudio asked him, so imagine you are standing at the cathedral looking at the direction, I don't know the statue at the other end of the piazza, but looking at this, right, and describe everything that you see, right? And so the patient, consistent with this idea of neglect, described only the stores that were on the right side of the piazza when he imagined being at the cathedral looking the other way. Now, Claudio did the ingenious manipulation saying, now I want you to imagine you're at the statue looking at the cathedral. Tell me everything that you see. And the patient, even imagining the perspective changing, was only able to name the stores on the right side. So one of the earliest sort of studies that came out of here, exactly this university, of looking at neglect as being not necessarily a problem of vision, but of attention, right? This idea that your brain, that when you have right hemisphere damage, your brain is not attending to the left side of space, even when you're imagining scenes like the piazza, right? And being able to describe it. And depending on where you imagine yourself looking, the left side of your space drops out, right? So it was like a very, very, very famous cognitive neuropsychological case study done here. And yeah, I'm sort of in the presence of greatness here. So this would be what's called agnosia or hemianopia, and then other disorders related to right hemisphere, constructional apraxia. So people have problems with spatial representations of shapes and copying shapes. And then they have some language disorders, right? So some of the main problems in right hemisphere disorders involve pragmatic language use, but also the ability to tell stories that are coherent and to understand discourse, right? To understand the sort of complexity around the global themes around a discourse. So the example of drawing in right hemisphere, this is a very much like sort of the analog of what you would see in drawing is what their language looks like. Person with a left hemisphere lesion produces a sort of a global gist of what a house looks like. You can tell this is a house, but it doesn't have a lot of details. Person with a right hemisphere lesion, typically what they look like is they'll produce tons of details, but it's really, really hard to tell that it's a house, right? So, and you can think of, well, what would this manifest when they tell a story, right? Detail after detail after detail after detail, but nothing is connected to the last. So it's hard to tell what they're talking about, right? They have local detail, local coherence. Every word is coherent to the last, but the story doesn't make sense, right? So that's a common theme about right hemisphere disorders. So what we were interested in is looking at, using this, using a tool to actually figure out, well, how does this impact discourse in right hemisphere disorder? What does the right hemisphere do for us in understanding language? And what we found is there's this, interesting work on phonology and the right hemisphere. It's by David Popple. It's known as the asymmetric sampling in time hypothesis. Now, what asymmetric sampling in time is really, really an interesting phenomenon. So as I'm talking, you are hearing phoneme transitions basically that are happening faster than the refractory periods of neurons. So my speech, the acoustic energy that's coming into your brain, the transitions are happening faster than your neurons can fire. So one of the big mysteries of neuroscience is, well, how does our brain process information that's happening faster than it can process, right? But it does. You can understand me even though I'm speaking quickly in English. And so the thought is, at least what the left hemisphere of your brain and the right hemisphere of your brain both divide the labor in different ways of understanding speech and language. So Popple's hypothesis showed that when you're hearing phonemes, the left hemisphere of your brain is very, very sensitive to letter, basically phoneme, 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 phoneme. It does very, very rapid transitions between sounds. And what the right hemisphere does is it doesn't care about those rapid transitions, phoneme to phoneme. What it cares about is larger chunks like syllables. So what you have is, as you're hearing speech, the left hemisphere is processing every sound. And the right hemisphere doesn't care about every sound. It cares about larger chunks like syllables and words. Both the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere are contributing to speech perception, but they're happening on different time scales. So one of the things that's in phonology and acoustic perception, one of the things we investigated in our study was, well, maybe something similar happens in semantics and language production. That is, maybe when you're hearing a story, the left hemisphere cares about relating the meaning of one word to the last, and the right hemisphere cares more about integrating each word with a much, much wider gist that's happening over time. And so the example would be like if you were hearing, I was trying to think of a story earlier, I said Cinderella, but I'm in Italy. I should say like Pinocchio, right? You're hearing the story of Pinocchio, right? You might have you're relating every word to the last, your left hemisphere. But then every new word, you're also relating, well, okay, well, how is this word integrated into this model of what I have of this story of this wooden puppet, and he wants to become a boy, and each new word is integrated into it that way. But I don't care so much about its relation to the last word. So we had this hypothesis that our brain, our left hemisphere, does these very, very rapid transitions of meanings between each word, and the right hemisphere cares about more broader transitions between word to paragraph or word to phrase. So how did we look at that? We tested them by manipulating semantic distance of words in an fMRI study. Now, how this works is, so what is semantic distance? We all have intuitive notions of what semantic distance is, but the simplest case of semantic distance is this idea of it's an empirical measure of similarity or difference between any two words or concepts in an n-dimensional space. Right? Sounds complicated, but it's not. Let's work up from a one-dimensional space. So let's say you're an emotion researcher and you think that the brain only cares about one dimension, right? And that dimension is pleasantness. So you might have rating differences for two words, work and play, in valence space, right? In a one-dimensional semantic space of valence, the difference between work and play is these, 2.5, right? So you might say 2.5 is a semantic distance between work and play in a one-dimensional semantic space, okay? So this is the most simple thing, a one-dimensional space. Let's build up to 2 dimensions, right? So let's say, okay, I'm going to build up a more sophisticated model, multi-dimensional model. I think pleasantness is one factor and dominance is another, right? So you can grab dominance norms for work and play, and you can grab valence norms for work and play. And that same Euclidean distance formula that you learned about in like 9th grade, you can calculate a distance across 2 dimensions between work and play and get one number, right? And so that will give you, so basically these are on rated norms. You can have in a 2-dimensional semantic space, dominance and valence, the distance between work and play is some finite number, right? So any word pair you can do this, and with Euclidean distance, you can just build up dimensions, right? You could build this to 300 dimensions and get a distance between work and play. Now the problem with that is, of course, that we have much higher dimensionality in the human brain than 2 dimensions, right? It's not valence and dominance, it's a lot more than that, right? In the human brain, we have absolutely no idea of what the dimensional space is. We don't know how many dimensions, we can never know, right? We can never know it's a latent space. And so one thing we've been doing in our lab is investigating what are called experiential semantic distance ratings. And that way we have basically, I think now, 80,000 English words, each rated by humans across a lot of these different dimensions: anger, auditory salience, contempt, disgust. And what you have is for each of these words, you have ratings, I think, by 60 people on how much does this word make you think of color, or how much does this word make you think of disgust. And that 15-dimension vector characterizes each word, and it's based on human ratings. And what we're calling these is basically our experiential semantic norms. Because they're real, they have psychological reality, like how much does it make you think of color when I say apple. You can rate that and it'll give you a numeric reality. Now, that's very different than the type of semantic knowledge that the way machines represent concepts or words, right? Which is through high dimensional vectors that are derived through co-occurrence statistics. So the models that you know about in deep learning, right? So the models that you might have heard about, the early models, LSA, latent semantic analysis, word2vec, these work on characterizing each word or concept across hyperparameters, which are these abstract mathematical parameters. So glove, the typical one is 300. You have a vector of 300 parameters for cat and a vector of 300 hyperparameters for dog. And the way that you analyze distance between cat and dog is not Euclidean the same way it is in that other thing I showed you, but using cosine distance. So you do the cosine distance of this 300 dimension vector to another one, and it'll give you a measure of similarity between dog and cat. Word2vec does it a different way than LSA. Glove does it a different way than these other two, but there are similarities in the process of how you train these models. And then the differences come later down the road in how they sort of compress the space. So we built an R package. So in doing this study, we built an R package called Semantic Distance. It's free. You can download it now. And basically what it does is it computes a rolling measure of semantic distance in any language sample that you give it. And so how this works is you can analyze semantic distance between word pairs like as a bag of words, right? Dog and cat. But what our package does is you can give it a continuous language sample. You can clean the language sample, take out stop words and everything, and it will give you a sequential semantic distance between each word to the last, right? Or that would be a word-to-word semantic distance. And how this works would be you give it a language sample, let's say dogs and cats love to play. Language samples that you typically give from a transcript have a lot of punctuation and garbage in it. It cleans it out, takes out stop words, and then lemmatizes. So that dogs and cats love to play would turn it into dog, cat, love, play. You then, it creates a semantic distance between each word pair like this. And then it plots the semantic distance as a continuous time series. So you can then analyze the sort of fluctuations in semantic distance across any language sample, okay? And that's neat because it can tell you where the jumps are, right? And we were interested in, again, in Alzheimer's disease and discourse and saying, well, you know, if people have semantic impairments, maybe their distance is just all over the place, right? Or maybe we could measure distance in some other way, right? So the idea is that we take the semantic distance that many of these models use for pairs and that we use it for continuous language sampling. So the other thing that the package does that's important here is that as an argument to the function, you can change the n-gram size, right? And so changing the n-gram size would be like, one would be like you can get semantic distance from every word to the next. And the other option that you can do is that you can change the n-gram size. So that's a free parameter in your model. So if you wanted to do the distance between the vectors for every 2 words to the next, it will give you a rolling measure of semantic distance for every 2 words to the next word, 2 words to the next word. And it rolls all the way across your language sample, giving you that distance. So what does that tell you, right? So remember, back to the hypothesis, we think that the left hemisphere cares about word-to-word transitions, right? Dog and cat. But we think that the right hemisphere cares about large groupings of words or phrases or paragraphs to the next word. So what we did in this study is that we came up with vectors for word-to-word semantic distance, and then a combination of 2 words to the next word, then 5 words to the next word, and then groups of 10 words to the next word, with the idea that we're going to see how much your brain cares about word to word versus the average of 10 words to the next word. So the semantic distance package, you can download it if any of you have trouble with it. It gives you we programmed lots of different options for it. You can specify the n-gram size. You can specify whether you want it rolling, like every groups of 2 words to the last. Sometimes people are more interested in the distance from some anchor point, like the beginning of the narrative to the next. So if you were, let's say, testing kids, right, and you're interested in saying, like, I want to see how far they vary from the starting point, you can set the anchor of the beginning and just say, like, how far are people straying from the beginning? The other thing that it does is it does some really, really interesting sort of k-means stuff behind the scenes to aggregate and produce network models of bags of words. You can give it a list of 10 words, 20 words, 30 words, And then behind the scenes, it will do all the work of running k-means, hierarchical clustering. And so this is like, it did it perfectly, you know, basically put a bunch of musical instruments in clusters next to weapons, next to emotions, right? So you just give it a list of words and it finds the structure and it will visualize it for you. Okay, so what do? We use the fMRI naturalistic listening paradigm. And we, so people, participants, 79 of them, got in the fMRI scanner. They used MRI compatible earphones. They listened to a podcast from an American talk show called Fresh Air. The specific one was two people talking. It's a dyad, and they're talking about the potential of genetic tests. So what we did is, and so these are, you know, table 1 here from our Cortex paper was basically like, it's like some, you know, how many counts, how many types, how many tokens were in the podcast. I think it was 8 minutes long, somewhere like that, and pretty well understood, basically eighth grade level, reading level. So what we ended up doing is we first coded the event. So we took we transcribed the raw podcast, and then we split it. So every word becomes a row, right? Every word becomes a row down here, down this way, and every word gets a timestamp. Right, so you have the start of the word, the talker here is who's talking, which of the people are talking. And then we did some text cleaning, like we got rid of stop words. And then what you end up having is like the podcast gets this transformed into this vector of 1 word per row with a timestamp. And then we start appending metadata to each word, right? And so, and those metadata are added as regressors. And so we added the Shannon entropy, when this went to a review, we had some reviewers that said, well, how do you know it's not this? How do you know it's not this? How do you know it's not this? So some of these regressors we added in as responses of being like, is it, you know, someone said, well, I don't think it's semantic distance, it's surprisal, or I don't think it's this, it's word frequency. So we added those in too. Okay, so participants, these are garden variety, boring young adults, about 79 of them. There is a strong female bias here, as there are in most psychology studies. Mean age was 23. These folks had no reported history of neurological disorders, learning disability, no hearing loss, and they're English L1, so they could speak other languages, but they needed to be at least proficient in English, or English as their dominant language. So what we ended up doing is we used a Siemens 3T scanner at the University of Connecticut. We did pretty, for people who do imaging, it's pretty standard stuff, except we used a multiband imaging sequence. Multiband's a little faster, so our TR was 1 second. We use an ascending slice order, so we start at the beginning and it's interleaved, we go up. You know, smallish isotropic voxels. Nothing really, you know, out of the ordinary here. Pretty standard vanilla fMRI scanning sequence, structural, functional, and then you co-register the two. So again, people are passively listening to this podcast. Every second, we have a new repetition time, which is a new slice acquisition, and we're modeling that every second of functional scanning we're yoking that to the word onsets, right? To figure out how much does the brain care about the transition between each word, or the transition between groups of words to the next. We used AFNI to process the data. Again, Talerac normalization, some smoothing. We applied a whole brain mask and got rid of all the voxels that are outside of the brain. Cluster thresholding, we did 143 voxels, and that our group level alpha was set at less than 0.01 for multiple comparisons. So what do we find? We ran amplitude modulated regression. Basically, the idea is that we have, for each word, we have signal intensity across these regions of interest. We have that's n-gram, it's a basically semantic distance from glove embeddings for, you know, 1 word to the last, then 2 words to the last, 5 words to the last, and 10 words to the last. You know, as you might imagine, each of those has a slightly different number of observations for each of those vectors, because taking the first, there aren't 10 observations before the first word, So the first 9 rows of your data are missing, and then you have a complete vector after that. So there's slightly different number of events for the 10 gram to each word than the 1 gram. And then we had these covariates because our reviewers said, well, no, I don't think any of it is semantic distance. I think it's word frequency. And one other person said, I don't think any of it is that. It's phonological neighborhood density. So we added those in. And we added a few other variables in post hoc when after first round of review, they said, okay, well, you put those in, but now I think it's other things, right? It's these other variables, right? This is very common. Many of you, if you've gone through review, you know it's heartbreaking and continues to be heartbreaking for a long time. Okay, so what do we find? So we look at the relationship between these variables, right? It's not surprising that you see semantic distance being correlated with itself. So the correlation between semantic distance for the 2 words before is correlated 0.82, so a high correlation with 1 word before. But the correlation starts to drop, right? The larger the n-gram size before each word. And that sort of makes sense. The idea would be like you have a tremendous amount of variability in processing word-to-word semantic distance and noise. But when you look at a group of 10 words, it starts, the change becomes much, much slower. So think about like the story of reading Pinocchio or telling the story of Pinocchio. You might have a few words in there, weird words in there, but the story itself, the skeleton of the story really isn't going to change a whole lot, right? And so this correlation between this sort of small or diminished correlation between 1 gram and 10 gram reflects that, right? Pinocchio stays Pinocchio even if you have a weird word or 2 in it. The story structure changes slower. Surprisal, which I spelled wrong there, and then this is in the paper, which I just noticed. That's all right. So surprisal was not correlated strongly with any of these variables, and so the thought is at least that possibly another thing that could suck up a lot of variance in this could be surprisal. Now, what we found is that, and what I was talking to Fabio earlier, is that there's a difference between surprisal. What we think the surprise reviewer meant was next word prediction. And those are 2 different things, right? So if you have, I don't know, the dog bit the something, right? If it was like the dog bit the, what would be the word that you would fill in there? The dog bit the, or let's say the dog chased the cat, right? So now, if the dog chased the cat, and if we say almost like most of us put in the word cat, right? So cat would be strong next word prediction. It really wouldn't have anything to do with surprisal in that case. So surprisal, in terms of its formal definition, came out of like the Bell telephone engineering thing in literature. It's the negative log of its frequency in that corpus. Basically, the idea would be like words that have surprisal have very, very low frequency in a corpus. That just means like they have more information content. So in that case, if you predict the word cat, that has nothing to do with surprisal. That's next word prediction. And next word prediction is primarily how LLMs work. And I think, when people they can confuse the 2. There's a whole paper by Andrea Martin on why people sort of confuse surprisal and what next word prediction means. It means a different thing. So surprisal we calculated here using the old Shannon entropy formula. There isn't correlation with semantic distance. There are correlations with semantic neighbors, and then negative correlations with word frequency. Okay, so let's get into what we found, and then I want to leave time for like questions for how you would work on semantic distance yourself on this package and what questions you might have in your own populations. So what we ended up finding is when you render your results, so up at the top, it's word-to-word sensitivity for semantic distance. We got very little reliable activation, and probably both in the left hemisphere and the right. When you raise the sort of cluster threshold, you get a lot of left anterior temporal lobe activation, which is kind of what we would expect, but not a lot of right hemisphere activation. But when you apply a stringent cluster threshold and multiple corrections, you don't get a lot for word-to-word comparisons of semantic distance, probably because each one is noisy. The other thing that happens, why you don't, is that you might have low semantic distance or semantic distance that means something within a sentence, but the words that end a sentence to the next sentence are very, very high semantic distance. So semantic distance, when you look at it word to word in a continuous narrative, can be very, very, very noisy. Now, where these patterns start to make a little bit more sense is when you start looking at larger chunks of words to the next. So 2 gram sensitivity of semantic distance would be here. You're showing sort of the classical combinatorial areas, anterior temporal lobe, but then the right hemisphere starts to come on. Also, now the key to this story, I think, is that that right hemisphere activation became more and more robust the larger the n-gram size. So the left hemisphere cares about combinations, but really the larger that space is that precedes a word, the right hemisphere gets more and more engaged or seems to care more about it. And so, the question is like, okay, well, what does that mean? One is, at least these data, what we think is that the right hemisphere does do something for semantic memory. And it does a lot of things for semantic memory, but the big one involves how to integrate across connected discourse. Here, you're hearing a story, right? You're trying to figure out, well, how does each word relate to the story of Pinocchio, right? I'm building this model of what Pinocchio is about. How does nose fit into that story versus nose fitting into the word before, which might be Geppetto, right? And your right hemisphere cares about Pinocchio nose being in this story about a kid. It doesn't care about Geppetto as much, right? And so the neat thing about that idea is that these distance things are happening not serially. It's not like the left hemisphere is doing one thing and then the right hemisphere is doing it. They're happening both at the same time. So the left hemisphere computations are happening word to word, right? It's caring, how does this word relate to the last? How does Geppetto relate to nose? How does wood relate to puppet? It's doing that probably in the anterior temporal lobe. It's doing very, very fast combinatorial combinations between each word. Right hemisphere is saying, you do your thing, right? You do your word to word thing. I'm interested in Pinocchio and how this and how the situation model of this story, how everything integrates in that slower change. So the thought, at least here, is that we think somewhat semantically in these stories, it's the right hemisphere behaves in some ways like it does with phonology, with David Poppel's idea that it's asymmetric sampling. Fast sampling or fast changes are really, really happening in the left hemisphere. Slow changes and slow integrations happening in the right hemisphere. And both of those combine to let us understand language in connected discourse. So, if it were a set of single words or something like that, you would often not see right hemisphere activation, right? So if you were looking at an fMRI task of like a lexical decision paradigm where you just have to decide, is this a word or not? You don't have to integrate across a large context. There's no context, right? You would see left hemisphere semantic network, just like in the first slide. It's when you have to really sort of figure out, well, what's the story? How do all these words come together, that the right hemisphere starts coming on. And again, the interesting story is both of those processes are happening at the same time, and the brain is then organizing that information. Fast and slow come together, or it's synthesized so that you can understand the story as a whole. And then also deficits. So this can also explain why some deficits, like people with right hemisphere disorders, are sort of good at understanding single words and really, really bad at understanding coherent stories, right? They can't figure out what's the inference. If you ask them what Pinocchio is about, they sort of can't pull it together, or they're very, very literal about the words that they mean, but really can't tell you the overall meaning of a story. And sort of like, it fits these data, I think, in healthy normal adults with fMRI sort of fit with that story of brain injury, and particularly high-level discourse. And that's it for my story. So I want to leave lots of time for you questions about our package, questions about what this means, especially like if you all work with different populations or work with language data where this could be used. One of the things I presented on our other conversation data in Rome last week, we talked a lot about this idea of being able to adapt this to Italian. right? And so this semantic distance package could very, very, very easily be adapted to Italian. You just need a set of words with embeddings. Now, this package, it gives you experiential semantic distance, which is these ratings on 15 different human rated dimensions, but it also gives you glove embeddings. It's for the same set of 2 words. Now, I don't know how much data exists from human ratings from Italian that you could generate this list that you could use experiential ratings, but you could certainly add a long list of embeddings, sort of generated from glove or BERT or whatever model that you want. So if anyone's interested in sort of adapting the semantic distance package to Italian, all you have to do is send me a list of words and embeddings, and it'll do it. Now, there's other sort of nitty-gritty questions like, lemmatization and things like that, but that's problems we could probably easily solve. So let's go with we have left some time for questions. Please, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming. Yeah. All right, questions? Please.
I don't know if this is what I'm going to say is fitting this perspective, but one problem would be pronoun resolution, because these may require long distance dependency, and I wonder whether so you can find something similar when you have to resort to interpretation of pronouns.
That's a great question.
In the light of the fact that I don't remember the facts, but I think that physics had problems with pronouns.
Yeah, this is a great question. So, again, like when I started looking a little bit at discourse and Alzheimer's disease, one of the big problems why it's confusing to talk with someone with Alzheimer's disease is they have problems with anaphora, right? So they'll start a story like, he went to the store, and then it'll turn into she, like you never know who the he is talking about 3 sentences in. So like this is the pronoun resolution problem becomes really, really hard. So the bad news is that our package treats pronouns as stop words. Now, the problem with that, right? So there's good things and bad things with that. So our package now, you can optionally keep pronouns, but the semantic vector for a pronoun is not reliable, right? So if you're talking about he and you mean Donald Trump versus he and like someone who is like, okay, right? They have the same vector, right? When you might mean something entirely different because the he is referring to something that is not specified. So the he as a static semantic vector sometimes doesn't make sense. So if you went like, he went to the store, right? And you're like, he and store, you could get a distance between the two, but it wouldn't necessarily make sense in a way that. So there's arguments both ways, right? When you cut out pronouns, because some people care about pronouns in these models. So there's theory on linguistic distancing and that he and I mean things, right? So like when you say I versus he, it actually it conveys emotional content, and that we shouldn't be thinking of these as stop words that you just get rid of. So our package now basically like it computes semantic distance, getting rid of some of these words. You can leave them in though, but it doesn't do any resolution. It treats them as basically, I don't even know. It'll generate this vector, he went to the store. But doesn't do any sort of resolution on what it means.
I have a question on how you conceptualize this distinction between that, right? Like, do you think it's a dual system, or is it like a gradient where you have like I don't know, shorter, like 2 words or 3 words or 4, or like 2 and 3 and then?
Good question. So I don't think it's like something that immediately comes on at one point, right? I think, and we also don't know if it's a function of things like word length. So we know at least in the speech literature when the right hemisphere seems to be much more active during to syllables than to individual phonemes. So that chunk seems to be the syllable level. But in semantics, it's really, really hard to tell, right? Because you could have one word that is a compound word that could be the right hemisphere could care more about that. So I don't know that this distinction, they're probably both doing a little bit of computation around, you know, longer distance dependency, shorter ones. And it is probably a gradient as opposed to a fixed thing. But yeah, I haven't looked at that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, not really. I was wondering what would be most advantageous, like disaggregate these kind of computations, or maybe leave them, or I don't know.
I think, you know, from a human adaptation standpoint, I don't think of things as being that like cut and dry, right? So the idea that like each could do a little bit, right? The left hemisphere could do longer distance computations, but it's not really good at them. Seems to be more of like the principle of like how, you know, when I think of like acquired language disorders works. So like what we know about like stroke and like the left hemisphere, when people have a lot of language impairment on the from a left hemisphere damage, they can do, right hemisphere, I'm trying to think. So there's a thing called abstract word dropout where people become very, very concrete. And so the idea is like when you're using the right side of your brain and the left side, it isn't working very well for producing language. The right side can do it still, but not nearly as well. And so the idea is that you want some redundancy. Both should be able to do some of the other function, but not very well. And I think that's probably it, probably what's going on. Sure.
Thank you for the stuff. I was wondering about this, you know, in this slide, you have this point about simultaneously divided labor.
Yeah.
I was wondering about whether you also looked at timing of the facts of these two, you know, hemisphere and or.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you know, one of the ways to do this would be to really get at both of your questions would be to sort of manipulate the distance between words, right? So if you're hearing a story and it's like Pinocchio went to, right? And you're getting this, like you have these long distance dependencies, but it's not dependent on rapid sort of speech coming in. You might be able to isolate, well, is it like how fast the words are coming in, or is it the amount of information that you're trying to integrate? So I don't know the answer to that question. Like, I don't know if it's because, you know, the right hemisphere is just slower in processing, or if it's something about information processing where it cares about bigger chunks. So I think you could experimentally sort of tease that out by saying like, I'm going to do the same thing, but there's going to be long delays between each word. And then you're like, okay, if the right hemisphere still cares more about these 10-word chunks, then you might have your answer, right? Is it just speed in which speech is coming in, or have people read it, right, at their own pace? It'd be harder because you wouldn't be able to figure out what word they're on unless you're doing eye tracking with it. No, that's a great question. Yeah. Thank you.
What are your thoughts about the possibility that it may, to some extent, not necessarily be about the hemispheres, but rather be about the material? Or, I mean, what are your thoughts about this? So, like, is it because the hemispheres are truly like that, and like, no matter the material, like right hemisphere has like this type of like process, this type of relationships, and left in this other way, or rather it depends on the fact that you're using language. What would happen if you were to use something that is more, I don't know, advantageous for the right hemisphere, so like, I don't know, some visual spatial material, you may find still some semantic relations. So just, I mean, I know probably it is kind of different to have a task like similar to that, but still having like processing.
Yeah.
And I mean, it could be as simple as a film, maybe. I don't know. Yeah. And which you like look at pictures, and then you try to like extract like semantic relations in the same way. But you anticipate to find the same pattern or a reverse one.
It's a really hard. That's a great question. One of the things with silent movies, like where you take out the sound and you're like, okay, I'm gonna try to extract language out that is that people they assign language even when there isn't, right? So they sort of reinterpret the scenes using language very often. So it's not like you have a silent movie as a non-linguistic condition, right? So that's where it ends up getting hard, is trying to figure out how do you pull out language from that sort of task. The idea with it would be like the right hemisphere does integration, right? It makes a story out of something. Now, the problem with that is like if you have like, you know, shape after shape after shape, or just lists of emotions, it's very hard to pull a story out of that. They're just individual things. But yeah, you know, if it's like, you know, a scene of something happening, and you have to remember different parts of the scene and then pull them together into a story. And if there's a way to do that non-verbally, or a way that language wouldn't contaminate it, that would be how to tell, you know, if the right hemisphere behaves the same sort of way. The other way you could do this would be, you know, a knockout study. So if you wanted to do a TMS study and do this kind of virtual lesion stuff where you're sort of knocking out the right hemisphere and seeing if you have the effects on being able to be like, tell me the story of Pinocchio after you just heard it. And you could know like sort of like word to word transitions, but really not be able to piece together the story. That would be closer to some, I think, some causal evidence that the right hemisphere is doing this integration stuff. But I don't know. That's a good, if you think about it, email me if you come up with an answer. Yeah, I like the idea of like strings of symbols, but the problem is that it's hard to integrate meaning across them. You know, like telling a story about the symbols that you just saw or something like that is hard. And as soon as you have meaning, you assign, you recode it with language. That's a tough one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What about story grammars? So would that be something like that? So the plot of Pinocchio is something that I consider mind, and if it isn't, then you had a disconnected story, and you couldn't like make meaning out of it. And another way is maybe distal words versus narratives, so that makes a difference. And then third question I had was, what is the cross-linguistic sort of expandability?
That's a great question. So one thing we did with this story that was kind of neat was we wanted to see like, okay, let's. Yeah, and so this semantic distance, it can't do metaphors, and so you lose it, right? But we did do an interesting thing. So story, grammar, syntax, things like that. We did a permutation test of this study where we shuffled every word of the whole podcast, and then we did all of these semantic vectors and 1 gram for the shuffled one to see, and then we did that. We looked at the sort of we ran the reimaging on the shuffled one. The idea would be like if you get the words of Pinocchio totally out of order, how do you start extracting meaning? And you do. You start to see some, but not nearly as much as this and reliable as this. So story grammar is a tricky thing. This doesn't. You can look at distance, like word to word to word, you know, and see. You can see where these topic shifts happen because there's big jumps in semantic distance. But talking about like the story grammar itself, like it doesn't do that. Yeah, there's like strengths and weaknesses of this. Like anytime you want to layer more important things like prosody or syntax or morphology, it's just a dumb semantic thing that goes word to word, just on these vectors, and again doesn't recognize alternate meanings of things and metaphors. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is like I would love to get this. You know, I would love, so our other package, like we figured out a way to adapt it to Italian. I would love to adapt this to Italian. It should be easy if you can get me a list of Italian words with vectors. What's that? Well, you know, it depends on how much functionality you want to add to the package. So sometimes you want to get rid of stop words. Sometimes you want to lemmatize, and each language has different lemmatization rules. Stop words are different for each language. So the only things that are in this semantic distance database, that there's a lookup database that lives inside of it, right? And what that is a long list of 100,000 English words, each with embeddings and these other experiential vectors, right? That lives behind the scenes along with a stop word list. The only thing that to adapt it to any other language you would need is your list of words and their embeddings. And if you want a stop word list in that language or be able to lemmatize, and then you can adapt it to any language because the math is the same regardless of the language. It's, you know, getting the information, getting the embeddings. And it could do all the network modeling and all that. Once you get the words into a numeric format, everything, all the computations are the same. Again, it's not smart in terms of syntax and story. It's not subtle, and it's not smart. It can't detect jokes. It can't detect irony. It just does it raw, whatever word you give it, which is why you need longer samples, I think.
If you don't need this experiential rating data, we have semantic spaces for now a number of languages. So
Yeah. Oh, we could adapt this to any.
on the vector side, we are fine.
Yeah.
Even for kind of low resource languages, we have solutions. I guess as long as it's on Wikipedia.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is like you could, if you wanted to clean your data, you know, lemmatize it and take stop words out before, and then just pop it in as that, that wouldn't even need to be in the package. Like then if you have your vectors in there, it could be ready to go. Yeah, we could adapt it to any language that we have you have words and vectors for.
But are you assuming that the semantics of words is the same in any language, in every language? Because if so, the experiential thing that has been done for English shouldn't be done for Italian, or at least for two languages,
Yeah.
to check whether there is a convergence.
Oh, for sure. I mean, here you wouldn't be using translation equivalents. Like you wouldn't be, yeah. So yeah, if developing your own, yeah, it's like embeddings trained on, you know, Italian, then that works for Italian. But the experiential ones, you do have some.
Yeah, 1,100 words.
Yeah, not a lot. not enough for a lot. Yeah.
Did you try to test the separate contribution of the experiential part and
Well, yeah. So we didn't have enough. So we have our experiential database has 45,000 or 50,000 words, and we had too many missing values. Because this podcast was about genetics, and it had a lot of like complex scientific language that just aren't captured in the experiential norms. So the other problem is like you'll have a lot of missing data. In some of these stories, especially if it's like about proper noun, it has a lot of proper nouns, there's no values on any of those. So just like pronouns where it's like he, if you have a pronoun John doesn't have a reliable semantic vector, because you might have a really positive image of John and a different John's horrible. Right. And so, yeah, so if you have a lot of proper nouns like Pinocchio, I don't know if there's a semantic vector for Pinocchio. Yeah.
I have a few questions.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any ideas of how they might want to do this on their own work? Oh, yeah. Question.
All the questions were great, so I will ask for a stupid question.
Oh, so I love stupid questions.
Did you simulate the way it can carry out sampling of, in a way, different resolution? Because my question is, if you have a serial model, you would expect that at some point you have a divergence of sampling one hemisphere and the other.
Yeah.
And the prediction is, would you expect something in split brain patients? Like if you have a serial model, then you would expect some form of aphasia.
Yeah. No, that's a great question.
No, it's really stupid.
No. Before you asked it, now I think it's actually smart. No, that's a great question. Especially with split brain patients. You know, so one of the things with this is like, yes, we think that the left hemisphere is doing something fast and the right hemisphere is happening slow, but where does the integration happen? And when does the integration happen, right? So are they just two separate processes? They can't just be two separate processes that just stay parallel, right? There has to be integration that's happening here, but this doesn't say anywhere about where that integration happens. And then if you have, you know, no connectivity, if you have a split brain patient, does it not happen at all, right? Or does it happen in a really weird way? I don't know. It's a great question. I don't think I've ever seen a split brain patient in real life though. Do you all have them here often or see them? Yeah. Yeah, it's something you read about in textbooks, but yeah. No, I don't know. What would you think? Like how would you? It's a great question.
The point, if you have to sample the acoustic signal first into words, single words, and then into chunks,
Mhm.
you would expect that first you chunk single words and then you make bigger chunks. So the idea is that you should have a serial process at some point. But you do need to have a basic word-to-word chunking before the divergence. That's my idea.
Yeah.
And if you do, then the point is at what level this happens in the brain. And if it does happen, then would the transition across hemispheres be necessary or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question.
Actually, two questions.
Well, what about like, his point, I was speaking with the guy in front of you earlier about this idea, like, does it have to be serial or could it be in parallel? But again, like, fast and then somewhat slow transitions happen in the left and then slow, but a little bit fast in the right? So there is some overlap. But again, like both hemispheres can do the job of the other, but not well. And so they happen in parallel, but the real sort of like expertise is in the fast on the left and the slow on the right with some overlap or redundancy. The serial parallel is an interesting question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I know the answer. But if you look at the brain injury literature, the dissociations between narrative and discourse and right hemisphere are very striking. The idea that they just can't tell you the overall meaning of the story. If you see these patients, it's really real. They'll tell you some very sort of like 3 disconnected details about, like Pinocchio. They'll say there's a boy in it and there's a piece of wood. I think it's his nose. Right, that's the whole story. And those are correct details, but has nothing to do with the gist. And then people with left hemisphere, they'll tell you, again, like the gist, right? It's about a boy who was sad and wanted to be a real boy, puppet who was sad and wanted to be a real boy with no details. And at least, that, I don't know what if that speaks to the idea of serial and parallel. It does get to a little bit of that split brain thing, right? Like if you don't have that other side of the brain, what do you do? But it doesn't get to a real satisfying answer to your question. Yeah.
If I do remember correctly, Rolando, you have in the field of reading actually the role of the callosum, you just missed it. Do I remember correctly?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I may not to say that. I can just miss it. No,
It's less plausible.
no, it was mostly about the anterior commission
Mm.
The point was that, like, we tried to look with Cloud, exactly, what with the like where we could find some connectivity between semantic structures, and we assumed it was the callosum, but actually it's not. So the anterior temporal lobe is very little connected with callosum. It seems to be mostly connected through the anterior commission. So it's a completely different. And we had to go back to square one and redesign it because we thought it was actually some kind of callosal activity, but it doesn't seem to be. I mean, very least according to our data, callosum.
So where does the primary kind of ATL connectivity happen? Does it? Because I know there's like this frontal aslant tract, right? That like the anterior temporal lobe joins the frontal lobe, right, through this like big white matter tract. But I never really have seen like how the connectivity crosses, right? Where does that happen?
That was the point.
That's the tract.
I think it's mostly anterior commissure.
Oh, anterior commissure. Okay.
More as it is.
Uh-huh.
And the temporal pole seems to be mostly connected to the anterior commissure, not the.
Oh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
So it may as well be that like a big brain, but that's just theoretical.
Mm-hmm.
As a like a spare anterior commissure doesn't have any issues, but I don't know. I haven't seen one yet. So
Yeah.
They usually don't. They just cut the callosum. The anterior commission is spare.
So they do commissurotomies primarily for epilepsy, right? I mean, yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, I know the anterior temporal lobectomy patients, the ones that take the whole, left anterior temporal lobe out, they're hard to tell what's happening with semantics because they've had like decades of functional reorganization where stuff can go over to the right hemisphere. So it's hard to get a picture from the neuropsychology literature on that. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
The first question is about this 10-word window.
Uh-huh.
Which is this one.
Yep.
So one could say that it is big, but not big enough to capture discourse. So I'm wondering whether you have thought about other experiments where you manipulate really the whole thing. So, showing your podcast and then the very same data where you just shuffle the sentences.
Yeah.
You would expect that in that case, you would have a right wing, right wing.
Yeah.
Right wing activity.
Yeah, I mean, so this is an interesting question, right? So we were like, well, how much of a real window is taking 10 words after you take out stop words? And there's a lot of stop words, right? So it ends up being 10 words is like often 2 or 3 sentences, right? But then the other thing that's hard with that of being like, let's take a larger chunk of the story is as soon as you do that, like let's say you take a 50-word window, right? Which sounds reasonable, but then once you take that, you lose the first 50 words of your story. So you're already in like the middle of the story and you lose statistical power. So it's this trade-off, right? Of being like 10 words is just a few sentences and it's not global context. Maybe, a little bit, you could probably get a window of n-gram of 20 and be closer to like a paragraph. But you lose, as long as your story is really long, you'd lose the first 20 words of whatever your stuff is. Because then it starts doing that roll. First 20 to the next word until you get 20, it can't do a distance. Yeah.
Second question. Do you think, would your prediction be that if you go to certain phenomena where communicational language kind of dissociate, like certain range of the autistic spectrum, you would expect a difference in brain activation, so you would expect that those people have an issue that is more related to the right hemisphere?
Ooh, I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know anything about, what the sort of literature on autism and brain morphology is, particularly like functional differences. So I don't know, because there's also, there's lots of reasons why someone wouldn't be able to organize a narrative: executive dysfunction, semantics, syntax, pragmatics, just not understanding sort of metaphor and things like that. So yeah, I think it's going to take specificity. Here with the right hemisphere folks, I'm relatively certain it's this combination of being able to sort of integrate a gist, but there is that issue around, they're very literal in their language comprehension. Kick the bucket means kick the bucket, right? And so if you're not understanding that means die, and then your sort of the story schema that you build is going to be really, really different. Yeah.
It was just an idea. Since we're talking about testing it in multilingual perspective, there are databases of MRI data on large text, especially in Chinese, I know that. And they might work.
Yeah, there's lots of podcast listening data sets, fMRI data sets now too. So like you could try it and easily try it. I think the important thing, what's that?
Even without collecting your data.
Yeah, even without, there's so much data. That's the nice thing about the world right now is there is a lot of data and people are making it open. They're not always making it easy to, they're not annotating it it's not easy to work with these data that are not labeled or have good readmes, but there's a lot out there. Can you think of anything like the populations of interest that you work with where something like this might be useful? So we're doing like different applications of being like, we're using it to sort of come up with an automated way of doing topic modeling. So like when you have a story that's unfolding and then all of a sudden you get these big jumps in semantic distance, like all of a sudden you're talking about the weather. and you're talking about sports, right? You'd have this like these big jumps in semantic distance. You could put a marker there and make a bet and saying, okay, they're talking about a different topic model now, talking about a different topic, which is a really different approach than like sort of standard NLP, which uses a totally different mathematical distribution now. We have another method using this semantic distance that looks at verbal fluency. So y'all know what verbal fluency is? These tasks of like, tell me as many animals as you can in 1 minute, where patients, you'll ask them to do that. And so the idea they will produce a cluster of like house pets and then sea animals. So semantic distance can make this jump between you're in dog, cat, blah, 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 and then you're all of a sudden shark, blah, blah, blah. It can figure out when you've switched. So it can do some things like automated fluency. So there's a lot you can do with this. And even clinically, like if you're like, okay, I think a person with Alzheimer's disease is just all over the place. Lots of semantic distance, lots of incohesion. You could use this tool for actually giving language samples in and being like, yeah, their distance between every word is just all over the place. And that would tell you about their connected language, even more so than it would like in looking at like, what's their picture naming like. So those are just sort of, some examples if you thought of like semantic, sort of use of semantics in characterizing language.
You applied to fluency data to capture clusters?
I wrote this, paper in JEP and Bigram which showed it can work, but I've never actually tried it. I never tried it on clinical data.
It seems that, those patterns that you come up with, even visually, you can capture the flexion.
Yeah, you can see it. I didn't know the math behind it, but there's a time series method, I forget what it's called, where it will crawl, it analyzes the slope of each change between points. And once there's a bigger slope than like the last 10, they're called structural breakpoints, which I didn't even know about before. So basically you could feed your semantic distance time series into R, and it'll figure out automatically where your structural breakpoints are. And say, okay, that's where I think something changed. That's where I think something changed. That's where I think something changed. And that's like, if you want to automate this sort of a topic model of saying, yeah, that person was talking about sports, and then they changed the subject and are talking about food, right? You'd have a big semantic distance jump from sports to food, and it would be like, bam, something changed. And so you could use it for that.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.